So today's topic is slavery in the colonies. And I want to start with this idea that slavery is an ancient practice, a worldwide practice. What you see here is a picture of Greek slaves from about 2,500 years ago working in mines in Athens. And it was considered a very deadly, very brutal form of slavery, very high death rate. So there was nothing nice about it, nothing romantic about it. What you see here are pictures of slaves in the medieval era. So this would have been Christian Europe about, 1,500 years ago, something like that. The writing on the right is in Greek, so these might have been Eastern European slaves, Byzantine Empire slaves, or something like that. So slavery existed in almost every society, if not every society, in the ancient world. Egypt, China, Greece, Rome, and the pre-Columbian Americas. In medieval Europe, Central and Eastern Europe were the source of slaves for the Byzantine Empire and the Muslim world. And some of you may already know that's where we get the word slave. Slave comes from Slav, so Slavic peoples were the first slaves in the European world. In addition to that, from the 11th century to the 19th century, so for almost 1,000 years, Barbary pirates, these are Muslim pirates from North Africa, raided coastal towns in Europe seeking Christian slaves to sell in North Africa. So they raided Ireland, they raided what's now the southern coasts of Spain and France, Italy, and they just kidnapped people, basically, and took them back to North Africa and sold them into slavery. And we think over this almost 1,000-year period, they probably kidnapped and sold into slavery about 1 million people. So it's a pretty large amount when you consider the whole history of it. Now, however, in Western Europe, slavery had mostly disappeared by the late Middle Ages, by the time that the New World was discovered by Columbus and conquered by the Spaniards and the Portuguese and the French and the English. So slavery had largely disappeared, and this was because of the religion, Christianity. It was considered bad to enslave other Christians, for a Christian to enslave other Christians. And by the late Middle Ages, basically everybody was a Christian, except for a Jewish minority. And so slavery just sort of died out. In 1452, sorry, wrong date. In 1452, Pope Nicholas V granted Spain and Portugal the right to enslave Muslims, pagans, and other unbelievers. And the reason for that was that the Portuguese and the Spanish were beginning to explore Africa, and they were beginning to tap into a huge slave trade that already existed in Africa, but they needed permission, since slavery had died out, they basically needed permission from the Pope to enslave people again. And he gave it to them as long as the people were non-Christians, right, or heretics or pagans or something like that. And in 1537, a different Pope, Pope Paul III, forbade the enslavement of Indians. This was a turning point in history because they had tried to enslave Indians, and for one thing, it didn't work very well. They died quickly from diseases, probably more than anything. So they shifted. They had already been enslaving Africans, but now they shifted hugely to rely on the African slave trade. So a little bit about the African slave trade. So for centuries, Arab caravans had crossed the Sahara Desert to exchange goods for slaves, and about 1,000 slaves per year were sold to Arab traders, and then they were resold throughout the Muslim world. You can see here the trade routes. So people from North Africa and the Middle East would cross the desert. They would buy slaves in these regions. They would transport them back to North Africa or the Middle East, and they would sell them there. And this was a slave trade that existed before the Europeans got involved in the slave trade, before they began exploring the world and buying slaves for themselves. So basically what the Europeans did is they started landing around in here and buying slaves from the same African kingdoms that had already been selling slaves to Arabs for a long, long time. And this slave trade, this Arab slave trade, lasted all the way up until the end of the 1800s. There were a lot of interesting wars in Africa where the British, who were very anti-slavery by the 1800s, actually fought wars in Africa to try to end the slave trade, eventually succeeding. So how did the Europeans get into all this? Well, in the early 1400s, the Portuguese and the Spanish discovered the Madera and Canary Islands. They're not marked on this map, but these are the islands in here off the coast of Africa. So what was happening is Portugal was exploring the west coast of Africa, and it was looking for a route to Asia because it wanted to bypass Arab traders who were middlemen between Europeans and the Orient, that in China, India, people with goods that they wanted to trade for. So they were looking for a trade route around Africa, and they came into contact with these African kingdoms. They discovered these islands, and that led to colonization, the creation of plantations, and the use of African slaves. So they settled these islands. They began raising sugar. There were native people on the islands called Guanche, and by the 1490s, they had basically died out from diseases and cruel treatment on the sugar plantations. And so the Portuguese began acquiring slaves and gold to use on these sugar plantations, the slaves to use in these sugar plantations. They began getting the slaves around 1450, and like I said, by 1490, the native inhabitants were basically gone, and they were relying exclusively on slaves to work on the plantations. Now, in order to buy the slaves, they relied almost exclusively on African kingdoms. So they very rarely acquired their slaves by doing raids and stealing people and loading them on the ship, kidnapping them basically. No, what they did was they made treaties with the African kingdoms in this area. And they set up posts on the beach, like you see here. This was a slave trading fort for many, many, many years, hundreds of years. The African kingdoms would acquire the slaves and then take them to the coast and sell them to the Portuguese, and then later to the Spanish and the English, the French, and so on, Dutch. Everybody got involved. And the African kingdoms would acquire the slaves by making war on other African kingdoms and capturing them and then selling them to the Europeans on the coast. Now, you might wonder, well, why did they do it this way? Why didn't they just raid Africa and kidnap whoever they wanted and take them that way? They really couldn't. The African kingdoms were too powerful, at least in the 1400s and 1500s, for the Europeans to just push around. So they really required the assistance of the African kingdoms to agree to sell them the slaves, to agree to let them establish forts on the coast. It couldn't have happened unless it was a partnership between the Europeans and the West Africans. So the first of these slaves, like I said, went to the Canaries and the Madera Islands. And then in 1492, Columbus lands somewhere in the Caribbean, and that unleashes the settlement by Spaniards and Portuguese of the New World, Central America and South America. They start planting sugar plantations almost immediately and other crops, and they start bringing slaves over by the early 1500s. So by about the year 1500, the Europeans are buying about 1,800 slaves a year from these West Africans, and they're sending them to the West Indies, which is these Caribbean islands, or they're sending them eventually to South America, where most of them would go. This little map is kind of useful just for seeing where slaves ended up. You can see a fraction of them, 3%, went to Europe. You can see another fraction, 4%, went to the British colonies, which is us, right? What's now the United States. But you can see most of them went to the Caribbean or to what's now Brazil. 1/3 went to Brazil, and almost half went to the West Indies, to the islands in the Caribbean Sea. And you can see by these little arrows here, there's still the Arab slave trade taking some slaves to North Africa. So the Spanish were the first to use African slaves in the New World, and they did this. They took them to islands, Cuba, Hispaniola, and the first African slaves arrived in Hispaniola in 1501. And over the next 2 centuries, or more, over the next 3 centuries or so, there were more Africans than Europeans that came to the New World, right? But they came in chains, right? Most of them, almost all of them. And overall, we think about 11 or 12 million Africans came to the New World as a part of the slave trade. And most of them, like I said, were sold either in Brazil or in the Caribbean. And British North Africa received about 4 or 5%. North America, sorry. British North America, our part of the world. This is a diagram from the early 1800s of a slave ship. You can see the inhumane conditions on board the ship. The people are packed. This is a diagram showing you how the people were laid down, kind of crammed in, right, to get as many people inside the ship as possible. And because of disease, because of maltreatment on board the ships, it was a very deadly passage. We call this passage from Africa to America the Middle Passage. The first passage was from the interior of Africa, where they were caught, to the coast, where they were transported by African kingdoms. We call this the Middle Passage because it was from the coast of Africa to the New World. And then the last stage was from Cuba or wherever to their final destination, Mexico, what's now the United States, or South America. But because of these brutal conditions, inhumane conditions, as many as 1 out of 6 or 1 out of 7 didn't survive the trip, died on the Middle Passage. So you do the numbers, that's 1 or 2 million people over 3 or 4 centuries. They died on the voyage. Now I want to focus on our part of the world, what became the United States. So the first African slaves in the present-day United States were in Spanish colonies in South Carolina and Florida. The first Africans in English North America were brought to Jamestown in 1619 by a Dutch ship. They appear to have been treated as indentured servants. Many, if not all of them, won their freedom by fulfilling a work contract or by converting to Christianity. And some, such as a really interesting guy named Anthony Johnson, even acquired indentured servants and slaves of their own. I'll mention him in a minute. He's a very interesting figure. So there were 23 Africans in Virginia in 1625, and by 1690 there were 950. Now that's still a small minority of the overall number of people in Virginia. So in the 1600s, slavery was not an important part of the economic life of Virginia. It was still mostly indentured servitude. But around 1700 that changes, and slavery becomes much more prevalent. So in the early 1600s, in the early 1600s, when the first African workers arrived, the legal and social status of these workers was fluid, especially at least in Virginia. What I mean by that is that they were treated like indentured servants, like white indentured servants, and most of them seem to have been set free after they finished their term of labor. They often worked together, lived together with the white indentured servants, and so there wasn't a clear distinction between them in these early 1620s, 1630s, 1640s. But The distinction between slaves and indentured servants grew rigid by the end of the 1600s, and in the early 1700s, colonial legislatures passed slave codes, which were legal codes codifying slavery and giving masters almost absolute authority over their slaves. There are a few interesting cases from Virginia that help you to see this transition from slaves being basically indentured servants to slaves being what you think of as slavery today. In 1640, a black servant named John Punch was sentenced to lifetime slavery for attempting to run away. So this is in Virginia, and he tries to run away. He's caught, and his punishment is he is condemned to a lifetime of slavery. This was the first case in the English colonies that legally sanctioned slavery. And then 1655, 15 years later, you had a case called Johnson versus Kaser. This is a fascinating case because the Johnson in Johnson versus Kaser is Anthony Johnson. He was an African who was a part of that 1619 trip. He was brought to Virginia. He was sold into indentured servitude. He worked some number of years, 5 years or so, I don't know exactly how many. He earned his freedom at the end of those 5 years, and then he bought his own land and his own indentured servants and his own slaves. And he became a planter in the colony. And he had a servant named Kaser, and Kaser claimed that he had fulfilled a term of service, it was probably 5 years, and was now free. And Anthony Johnson claimed that no, Kaser belonged to him for life, that he was a slave, not just a servant. So it's ironic because it's a case between two Africans over this issue of servitude versus slavery. Johnson won the case. The court ruled that Kaser was his slave and that Kaser belonged to him for the remainder of his life. And another interesting case, the next year, 1656, a woman named Elizabeth Key sued for her freedom. She was held in servitude, and she won. And her argument was twofold, and it was very interesting. Her argument was that she was free, not a slave, because she was half English and half African, and her father was an Englishman. And you may think, well, what difference does any of that make? She was appealing to an ancient English custom, kind of a customary law, that said that the status of a child is inherited from the father, not the mother. So in other words, if a free father had a child with a mother who was a slave, the children were free because they followed the father's status. They didn't follow the mother's status, right? And so she said, my father is an Englishman. My father is free. Yes, my mother was maybe his slave. I don't know those details, but a slave, a servant. But I don't inherit her servitude. I inherit my father's free status. The court agreed. The court said, yeah, you're right. Your father is a free Englishman. Therefore, you are free too. She also had a secondary argument, and she would have won on either one of these arguments based on English law at the time. She said that she had been baptized as a Christian in the Church of England. So she said, kind of either way you look at it, the second argument is, I'm a Christian, I was baptized, therefore I can't be a slave, because as I've already told you, the rule was you couldn't enslave other Christians. And the court set her free, right? She had two good arguments. Well, if we had followed those rules, imagine for a second that Virginia had said, yes, the rule is if your father's free, you're free. Yes, the rule is if you're a Christian, you can't be a slave. And it's been that way for hundreds of years, and we're not going to change it. That would have been the end of slavery in America, right? It would have never have lasted, because once a slave converted to Christianity, even if it was just nominal, even if they just wanted the paperwork, they would have been free. So in 1662, the Virginia House of Burgesses changed the laws. They said, Any child born in the colony would follow the status of its mother, not its father. So if a free Englishman had a child with a African slave, the children would be slaves. The children would inherit that status. That remained the law all the way up until the Civil War, right? So the precedent was overturned, the rule was changed because they didn't want to be setting these slaves free, basically. So they had to change the law. They also said that I don't remember if it was in 1662 or around this time, they said whether or not you're a Christian doesn't matter anymore. If you're a slave, you're a slave. End of story. So indentured servitude was how most people came to Virginia in the 1600s, and it was the main source of labor for plantations, tobacco plantations in Virginia. But a couple of things happened, really three things, I guess, that made indentured servitude decline significantly and slavery replace it by the end of the 1600s. So one, the supply of indentured servants declined as the British economy improved and poor British people had better options. So the only reason British people accepted indentured servitude in the early 1600s was they were basically so incredibly poor that selling themselves into bondage seemed like the only chance they had in life. But once things got a little bit better for them, that didn't seem like a very good deal anymore, and so they didn't want to come. Sometimes they were kidnapped and things like that, but it was harder to get them to volunteer to come. And then in 1675 and 1676, there was a rebellion, and this also was important. So it was called Bacon's Rebellion, and I won't give you the details because you don't need to know them, but the rebelling army was mostly comprised of indentured servants. It was actually a mix of indentured servants and slaves and other kind of outcasts in Virginia in 1675, but most of them were former indentured servants. And the rebellion ended, but after it burned Jamestown to the ground, after there was a lot of upheaval, a lot of chaos, and what seems to have happened is the planters decided right about then, these indentured servants are dangerous because they work for 5 years and then we have to set them free, or maybe it's 7 years, whatever, 5, 7 years. But then we have to set them free according to the law, according to the terms of the contract, and then they just start roaming around like poor beggars and pirates and vagabonds, and they become dangerous, right? And they form this rebellious army and so forth. So the thought was, if we switch to slaves, we never have to set them free. Now, it seems kind of backwards thinking. A slave class could also be rebellious, it could also be dangerous, as well as, of course, inhumane, but that seems to have been the thinking. And then a third thing happened. In 1697 or 1698, the Royal African Company's monopoly on the slave trade ended, and this caused the number of African slaves available to increase and the price of slaves to fall. So simple economics, there had been one company that had a monopoly in the slave trade. They had been purposely keeping the supply limited to keep the prices up, and that all ended around 1697, and suddenly slaves became relatively cheap and therefore just flooded into the colony. So by 1700, an interesting milestone happens. Most slaves in North America are born here rather than imported. That's an interesting phenomenon because in some parts of the world, for example, in the Caribbean, the slave conditions were so deadly because the sugar plantations were deadly, the diseases like malaria and other diseases were so deadly that basically the slaves died as fast as they could be imported. So they were constantly importing new slaves from Africa to replace the ones that were dying on the plantations. In North America, the conditions were a little bit more survivable, not because the people were necessarily nicer, but because I guess tobacco plantations weren't quite as deadly as sugar ones. And so you had, by 1700, a replicating population, a population of African slaves who are born here, right, and raised in slavery. By 1750, slavery was legal in all 13 colonies. By 1760, there were about 250,000 slaves in the colonies. And by the 1770s, when the American Revolution begins, about 1/5 of all Americans is black, of African descent, but most likely born here. And most of them are slaves. Not all, but most. So the vast majority of slaves were in the South. 60% of the people in South Carolina were of African descent, and the vast majority were slaves. But then as you go north, the percentage goes down. 40% of the people in Virginia were slaves, 8% in Pennsylvania, and only 3% in Massachusetts, where it was never a big part of the economy. Now, I mentioned earlier that if they were worried about indentured servants revolting, it seems like they ought to have been just as worried about slaves, because they were just as likely to want to win their freedom. There were at least 3 interesting alleged slave revolts in the 1700s that I want to talk about. So the first one I want to mention is called the New York Slave Revolt of 1712. So by 1703, about 40% of New York City households owned a slave. And on April 6, 1712, about 20 to 23 black slaves set a building on fire. When white colonists arrived to put out the fire, the slaves attacked with swords, guns, and hatchets, killing 9 people and injuring 6. About 70 black slaves were eventually arrested for the attack. 27 were put on trial, and 21 were executed. Stricter slave laws were passed in New York City following this. A couple of features of them: slaves were forbidden to carry guns, were to gather in groups of more than 3, and owners who wanted to set slaves free were required to pay a 200-pound tax per slave, which was much higher than the cost of a slave. This was an interesting economic thing. They wanted to, you see this not just in New York City there, but in Virginia and South Carolina. The laws actually discouraged people from setting free their slaves. And this was one of the ways they did it. You would tax the person more than the value of the slave, so that it would actually cost you money to set your slave free, right? More than the slave was worth. And they did this because they didn't want free blacks roaming around, basically. Another interesting and important rebellion is the Stono Uprising. So this is in South Carolina. You can see the Stono River here in the middle of this old map. So it started on September 9, 1739, when 20 slaves stole guns and gunpowder and killed 2 shopkeepers, and then started marching towards Florida, which was about 150 miles away. And they were headed towards Florida because Florida was Spanish, and the Spanish had offered freedom to any slaves who got there and who agreed to do military service for the Spanish. And so they started marching south. Another 60 or so slaves joined them. And so it became a group of about 80, maybe 80 to 100. As they were marching south, they burned 7 plantations and killed 20 white people. And then the next day, a white militia caught up to them, attacked them, and killed most of them. About 30 escaped from that initial attack, but they were hunted down within a week. So after the Stono Uprising, South Carolina made its slave codes harsher to restrict slave freedom. They made it illegal for enslaved Africans to assemble in groups, to move abroad, to move around without their owner's permission, to raise food, to earn money, or to learn to write. Here you see an early indication that slave owners feared writing and reading among slaves. They didn't want an educated slave population. And additionally, owners were given legal permission to kill rebellious slaves if necessary. And another interesting alleged slave revolt or slave conspiracy. And here, historians aren't sure if there really even was a revolt or not. So the facts are, this is New York City again. It's 1741. By now, New York City had the second highest slave population in the Americas, in North America. And there were several fires in Manhattan from March to April, about 10 or 13, including 4 fires on a single day in April. And so rumors spread that there was some sort of slave conspiracy or slave revolt that was happening. Well, and according to the story that eventually the slave owners believed, it was actually a conspiracy between slaves and white indentured servants. So a white indentured servant, an Irish indentured servant named Mary Burton, was forced to testify about what she knew. She said, or she testified, that there was a conspiracy of poor whites and black slaves to burn the city, kill all the white men, and take over New York. 200 slaves were arrested. They were interrogated. 34 people ended up being executed. 17 black men, 2 white men, and 2 white women were hanged. And then another 12 or 13 black slaves were burnt at the stake. The bodies of 2 suspected conspirators, a slave named Caesar and a white man named John Hewson, were gibbeted. That means they were hung on public display. Their bodies were left to rot. And this was a medieval way of making an example of people, of basically saying this is what will happen to you if you are a criminal or a traitor. Now, like I said, historians doubt that there was ever any plot. They think that what happened was these mysterious fires happened. People were paranoid. They imagined that there was some sort of a conspiracy among the slaves and the indentured servants. And then they basically tortured and beat some people into confessing, some slaves and some indentured servants, and hanged them and executed them and that sort of thing. And